Okay. So I'm the surprise talk today. My name is Balder, and I'm here to talk about neurostimulation. We have one of the demos afterwards, so I'm going to talk mainly about what we do at Science. My background is actually currently a little mixed, so I'm at the Technical University of Denmark, so as most of the guys here. I'm also the founder of the Copenhagen Institute of Neurocreativity, and I spend most of my time as the founder of Science Neurostimulation, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. At Science, we do 3 different things. So we do quite some work on trying to understand the sort of very basic functionality of the brain. So what happens in the brain during different type of tasks, and how can we improve that? Then we are very interested in some of the topics that Morten spoke about and Jason spoke about in terms of cognitive change. So what you see here is actually more or less what happens in your brains right now. So what you see here is a new synapses growing. So you can see here, new synapses forming and then pulling back out. And everything we do all the time has these impacts on our brains. So when you chose to spend 2 hours of your time being here, it actually has a huge impact on how your brain looks when you leave the room. And you probably heard the sort of story before that your brain looks different after leaving compared to when you came in. And it actually looks like this. So what we've been trying to do is to take control of that, because this happens all the time. But the question is, to what extent are we actually aware of that change, and to what extent do we take charge of it? So what we've been trying to do is to start building some devices where you can actually overrun or overclock these processes, because they will happen anyway. So why not take charge and try to shape your brain instead of just your brain being shaped? I love myths about the brain. People talk about the brain all the time, and whenever Morten did it earlier, whenever people say, you know, the brain works like this, I'm like, because we have all these, Jason also said it is the biggest organ in our body, or the most complex organ in our body. And it's so easy to simplify it, and this is probably one of my favorite myths, and it's still in the Oxford Dictionary. Right versus left brain, as if one part of our brain did certain functions and the other didn't. The only way to understand the brain is as a network. So there are multiple different ways of sort of trying to calculate it, but to me, the only meaningful way to understand the brain is as networks that are balanced in different ways. I'll get back to this slide in a second, but this actually shows one of the only type of brain calculation that makes sense to me. And this is, what's the consequence in one region when you have activity in another region? So it's not about this part being active, it's actually what happens in the rest of the brain when you have activity here. And this to me is sort of the only way of making sense of the brain, is trying to understand, if I relocate my activity to one region, it has an impact somewhere else. And what can I do to consciously sort of change or deal with that? And we do this all the time. So I had 1 beer and 2 cups of coffee today, and that's brain stimulation. So whatever you do when you digest something, it has an impact on the brain. And I think most people are fairly unaware of how strong those effects are. So have you ever considered, if you take a painkiller, what is the effect of that painkiller? What happens? You take it, you eat it, and then you don't feel the pain. But what is the sort of functionality behind it? And it's actually because you numb certain regions of the brain, so you can't use the chemicals that will tell you it's painful. So we do this all the time, but we have about 20,000 years of tradition of doing it through the mouth, sometimes through the nose, but mainly we sort of eat, drink, and then something wonderful happens, and we don't really think about the fact that it's all up here. And to understand the neurostimulation idea, so how can we actually work with our brain more consciously, we first have to start at the very basic. So this is essentially what happens in the brain all the time. So it's a chain reaction of an electrical signal or impulse that causes a chemical reaction that passes the signal on. So my ability to speak, my ability to move my arms is this chain reaction. So there's a signal causing a chemical reaction, passing the signal on. And that helps me to move my mouth and move my arm. And what we've been doing for 20,000 years is to work with this part of the chain. And what we've been starting to look at is, what about changing this part? Because it's equally important. Morten, one of my colleagues over there, exactly same beard, he'll be doing some demos afterwards where we have some funny gadgets, we have some ears, we have a game. Did you bring the drone? Okay. And what these tools do is they measure the electrical activity in the brain, so what comes out of all activity here. This electrical impulse will sort of come out of your head. So you can measure it, and you can use that signal to do different type of actions. So with the ears, Morten have them in his hand, it measures the amount of attention, and then the ears will change position based on how much sort of attention you have. It's a beautiful picture. And we also have a two-player game where you can play against each other in who is best at keeping concentration. But this is only looking at the electricity that comes out. What we started doing was saying, okay, so if your brain is emitting all these electrical impulses, what happens if you turn them around and put them back in? So what we've been doing for the last 2.5 years is putting a 9-volt battery to your brain. So you simply create an electrical circuit that runs to your brain. What happens is where you put the current into your brain, you will have an increased activity in that region, and where you pull it back out, so the current is flowing in one direction, when you pull it back out, you will have a negative effect. So what happens to the brain is sort of one region has a better potential for activity and the other has a worse potential for activity. This is a former colleague of mine, Mats. So it's a super simple technology, 2 cables, 2 electrodes, current in, current out, effect up, effect down. It's been used for about 15 years in a lot of different industries. It's been used for training pilots, training snipers, for treating depressions, for rehabilitations after strokes. And yeah. So what we've been doing is we put people in these kind of scanners. It's an fMRI scanner. And we'll look at what happens in the brain when you are under different type of tasks. And what's the difference between your brain when it's successful versus unsuccessful in solving that task. This is one example. This is a region of the brain that is used by expert improvisers. So people who make a living from improvising, they will activate a very specific part of the brain while they improvise, while the rest of us won't. And then we've been doing a lot of these studies, and we also looked to others. And we sort of came to this hypothesis about how should the brain look like when you're doing different type of cognitive work. So when you are trying to sit down at work and think of something new, or you sit down at work and really try to focus, what should your brain look like? And then we created a device that is trying to help your brain to get there. So I'll give you a very simple example of one of these findings. So what you see here is, as I showed, for most people, when they are trying to solve a creative task, they will have a lot of activity in the frontal regions of the brain. So they will try to boost concentration, focus, and really try to sort of activate memory. And what happens to low creativity performers is they deactivate the back of the head, which is more or less our dream region. That's where we have all type of random stimulation. What we saw in this study was, while the low creativity performers had a deactivation of the dream region, people who did really well in creativity had the opposite. So if you sit down, you try to concentrate on a creative task, instead of shutting down all type of sort of dreamy, weird input, you want to turn it up. So what we've done is we created a device that tried to replicate a lot of these things. So this is the Play-Doh Work headset. never pull something apart on stage. It doesn't have a battery. Is that an active one? Okay. Anyways, you can try it afterwards. So we'll do demos. Oh, that's a new one. Yeah. Okay. Never do a hardware startup. So it looks like this. I won't play it on stage. It has 2 electrodes in the front and 1 in the back. And what it allows me to do is, through my phone, I can help my brain to have more or less activity in these 3 regions. So if I sit down with a task and I feel I really sort of overthink this task, I can numb the right region of the forehead, and I can make it harder for that part of the brain to work. And following this study, this is probably one of my favorites. If I sit down and I feel I have too little stimuli, I can turn off for the electrode in the back, so I can actually replicate this finding and make sure that my brain has a lot of weird, input when I'm trying to solve a new problem. So you can try the device afterwards. Morten and I and some others will be over in that corner. If you have any questions, come and ask. And I guess that was it. Thanks.